I'm Mickey Pellerano, and this is Time Lord TV, the show where we talk about astrology, occultism, and how they interface with art and culture. It's a really special show today because we'll be interviewing Christina Engelhardt, actress and medium who in the 70s and 80s channeled the presences of trans-dimensional beings along with filmmaker Federico Fellini. They got messages on payphones most of the time in hotels throughout Rome, Tulum, New York, and sent them on a crazy odyssey that I first heard about from hearing Christina on the podcast Aliens and Artists. Christina details this fascinating journey with Federico Fellini in her recent book, Towards the Moon with Fellini. It's one of the most fascinating stories I've ever heard, both of transdimensional contact and of cinematic history. But first, we have our musical guest, FLUCT, a dance collective led by Monica Mirabile and Sigrid Lauren, performing with us here in New York City before I head out to LA to interview Christina. So, it's going to be an awesome show. We're going to start off with the astrological forecast for the month as usual, and then on to the show from there. Stick around.
Give me your tire. Give me your tire. Give me your tire.
Because I need that.
How long have you been here? And what brought you here?
An embodiment of a dignified posture.
Could you give me some idea? Whose idea was it that you come here?
God.
And what happened that ended up with your being here?
Power, and if something were to go wrong, something would happen, girls like me disappear all of the time.
Did he tell you why?
Well, did you bring your knee pads?
Welcome to the program.
Amazing. Well, you guys, that was fantastic. What's this piece you just performed for us?
Well, it's an iteration of a piece that's, the title changes often based on, sorry, I'm already like, you talk first.
The piece is called, in its latest iteration, it's called Foul. And that's where it's been left off. It's a piece that Sigrid and I, we typically make work that's just the two of us. And we perform it all around. And it changes slightly, determined by the environment. And so we sometimes change the name because the piece always changes. Mm-hmm. So the most recent iteration was Foul. Prior to that, it was Friar. And its original iteration, the title was Everything Makes Me Happy. And the work is pretty schizophrenic. It's about a lot of things. Cultural normativity slurred up into some kind of iteration as if aliens were staring down from their planet at Earth and trying to mimic it like a TikTok video.
Does it really have to do with aliens?
Well, we always say that is sort of what that's kind of the schizophrenia, like the frenetic energy and information that occurs it's like that's the best way to describe what we're doing, where we've absorbed all this information, this cultural information as human bodies, people, and now we're like unfolding it, and within that unfolding, there's a certain processing.
It's somewhat of an opening too. It's like, the last line is like, welcome to the program. And it's kind of that first moment of like, abrasion or something of us like dropping in like, oh, okay, you know. I think also it's interesting, the alien part. I don't even think I've thought about this before, but you know, in that recording, there's helicopters in the background while there's kind of the technology glitching, while there's like that man saying like, well, when did you get here? You know, blah, blah, blah. But
yeah. So if we can break it open, exactly what you're experiencing is amalgamated samples from various sound things that we have compiled from YouTube, philosophers we think are interesting.
But also memories. Like sometimes if I'm having a hard time, like trying to connect tissue, I'll literally like track back, like what was a movie I liked when I was like 10? And then it's like, there's like chaos magic in it in that sense where it's like, all of a sudden I go through and look at this like short 2-minute clip from whatever, Full House or something. That's not it, but something. And then you hear this strange quote and it's making us think about Harvey Weinstein or whatever. And then it's like, oh my God. And then we can then the thread goes from there.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by, I guess, the chaos where it's just kind of randomly pulling. And sometimes it's like a song from the 90s. It's like, I love that song. And I'm like, whoa, this quote's kind of fucked up.
Yeah, because I mean, specifically with that excerpt, the amalgamated portion is referencing a feminine experience in American culture, right. Which there's like one sample that's taken from this Missouri-based legislator from the House of Representatives who was looking for advice from a male leader, and his response was, well, did you bring your knee pads? And that might, you know, on one hand appear to be like, oh, like you better have brought your knee pads because this is hard work. But she was specifically in this video talking about like sexual harassment and the kind of, not only sexual harassment, but like like the demeaning nature of like men in power and the patriarchy within the political system. And so we had extracted that particular part and put it within this amalgamated form that also, where there's also other people talking about the same thing. Like it's a generalized concept that a lot of women experience in various forms, and we've put it into this like, you know, cut and paste sort of version that makes sense to the piece at large.
Right, because it might be systems or behaviors that are so entrenched that it requires some kind of sci-fi perspective almost, right? To see it from an exterior standpoint or see it from an exterior or alien perspective to realize how bizarre it actually is. And I love how you guys are implying or employing this kind of cut-up method, right? This kind of a Burroughs style where things are chopped up and then reconfigured, and then you see that like the seemingly absurd seems to fit together in a way that oftentimes can reveal the magical, but can also reveal kind of the poisonous in something as well.
You know, the process when we make a piece is always a bit twisted, and it goes forward and backward in terms of like, there's no choreography or the sound first. It kind of, through different practices we have, happens whatever time, but the last minute, we're always having to objectively look at this long thread of, this piece I think is like over 150 samples, but then there's also like original instrumental kind of manipulation.
More atmospheric, energetic motion music.
But for instance, I remember when we were finishing this piece originally, you know, like cutting to the wire, literally I think the day before, when we already thought we finished it, and you know, when we're performing, all of a sudden, we had these quotes, and just you know, even just having like a laughter or a cry at this real simple moment, we're like, oh my God, this completely changes everything. We have to, constantly just moving these little like vignettes, these small pieces, like the smallest piece is always
And that-
significant, that changes everything.
Right, because it's tied with movement as well. Like, it's a semiotic code, the whole thing is, and we're deciphering this semiotic code whilst making our own,
Right.
And that's like just a really organic, fluid, fractilian practice, And it's interesting because, like, in the piece we showed, in the section that we just performed, there's the one part where it's like, well, who did this to you? And we're like, God, And a lot of our work often has this question. Like, we had an exhibition like a couple years ago that was called "Is it God or Am I Dog?" And the question is really around like higher powers. Like, are you the higher power? Is there a power higher than you? Is that higher power something spiritual, or is it governmental, or like, what is the power dynamic? How much of it do you hold? Or are you just an animal? Do you have no control? And one of our like not biggest, but one of our early influences was Terence McKenna. We used to have this quote that was "Culture is not your friend" that we would play at the end of every performance.
Every performance, that was
the end.
It's funny to think about when that stopped.
What's your interpretation of that, and why was it such an important quote for FLUCT?
Well, on a very basic, like, I think, early level, which I feel like my answer that I want to come out with is like, well, something else, but is the manipulation of media and accessible media, and what's in front of our face all the time. And that being this, like, United States of America culture, which I think it is in a way specific too, and also in the attitude like Hollywood, the influence of that jump up.
But when it's a culture that's created by consumerism and commercialism and capitalism, it is something that denies you from your right to understand like what you're actually interested in, and like what makes you unique and how we are able to celebrate that uniqueness. And so that's why we were really interested in that quote, like why we used it, because FLUCT is about the exfoliation, and like physically, and like everything sort of leads to that processing of information that you had no choice but to absorb,
I love that, the idea of involuntary absorption, because in that sense, it's actually an anti-culture, right? If it denies you of your genuine impulses, or reduces your impulses to those that are strictly limbic, right? To those that are strictly reptilian, right? Or biological. And then what about your obscure interest in like Swedenborg or Buteau or something like this, right? That requires, at this point, Herculean effort to obtain true knowledge of, right? As opposed to kind of a barcode Wikipedia knowledge of, say, Buteau or Swedenborg or something like this, right? It robs us of our depth, and it robs us of the availability to tap into our passions that are more elevated than simply our pleasure and pain responses, right? Or our fear responses and things like that. So that's huge.
Yeah, I mean, and one could really argue that stuff, though, I mean, I'm being an optimist right now because I fluctuate between pessimist and optimist, but like one could argue that it also adds to those things, but only if you have agency. If you've never been given, and that's maybe what the physical somatic practice is really about, is understanding your sense of agency. Because when you have that sense of agency, you can look at a billboard and be like, oh, that is something I'm not interested in.
Occultism
like,
and how they interface
I feel like
with
that's
art
so
and culture.
much of it, because
It's a really special show today because we're interviewing Christina Engelhardt, actress and medium, who channeled
incredibly unique.
being.
And the somatic practice pulls you into your body. You know, like we live in this really disassociative world. It's easy to spend time outside of your body, looking at your phone, whatever. It's like really easy to do that. I am an avid disassociator. Like I do it all the time. I find myself just floating out of my body And I have to pull myself in and be like, oh, where am I? What's this environment? And when I'm pulling myself back in and realizing my body, it happens through these practices that we do, that we call training sometimes, which is like yoga and exercise, embodiment practices. Those things really allow you to tap into that agency because you're in a physical universe. That is where we are. You know, like this is the physical. It's not only that, but it is definitely that as well. You know, and so I think the body, the physical world is very important.
It brings you into your infinite. Is that a word? The infinite vastness or whatever, by bringing you into the present, by bringing you into like connection with your mind, body, spirit, or spirit, mind, body, or soul, or whatever. You know, you're able to take
It's triadic ballet.
if you're not projecting into the future or revisiting the past. And I mean, it's so tripped out. Like you're not only living like just outside, you're living either beside yourself, you're living behind yourself, you're living in front of yourself, looking at yourself. It's like so rare people are like living inside their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Scream totally disembodies.
I know. I want to do a couple takes. Yeah.
But another famous quote from Terence McKenna is, the scariest thing of all is that nobody's in control. You know, and he talks about how like, you know, there are major players in the world, but they're not what we think they are. Like the first one is chaos. The second one is like chance, and the third one is like randomness or something like coming up behind it.
Right. And these constructed ideas that we have of who is behind the wheel, when in fact, like, understanding the true chaotic nature of everything is disorienting. And I also love how it makes you question, you know, your own autonomy and, you know, how much you are subject to, say, conditioning, or how much you are subject to power struggles that are either, power structures that are either internal or external.
Dualism is obviously, plays this like major part because we're like, you know, control and lack of control. Like
the instigator of how we started working together.
But first we have our musical guest, FLUCT.
Meeting each other intimately in a moment. We were both having high fluctuations of emotions. And then sometimes judging those, like,
I can even just take
is it wrong that I feel this way or act this way, or is it wrong, or is it right, or okay, wrong, right, doesn't matter, blah, blah.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, because dualism seems almost like Newtonian or something, right? Where you have these like one force and another force, and it kind of narrows it down. Whereas something like chaos theory or chaos magic is like, no, we are all fractal, I believe is the word that you use. We're all part of this interconnected network of multiple like minuscule factors acting upon each other in a way that is grand and cohesive. So it's not one extreme or another. It's actually a united kind of field of reality that defines existence maybe more accurately. And then within that, there are, who knows, universes beyond our senses and universes beyond our sensual experience, you know, what we can experience with our five senses. And this sounds to me very much like your practice too as artists, that it starts off, okay, one interacting with another, but then the work begins to inform, or the outer sources that you draw from begin to inform the work, and then the work shifts, and that demands an organic shift from within. And then another factor, and all the interlocking factors, is really a mind that is extended beyond your individual minds. Almost like the piece itself derives its own mind. So it's like, who is in control? At the end of the day, the work ends up being this kind of controlling factor that's conducive to the result.
We had some trips, man.
Yeah, it's definitely existed outside of us in so many, you know, different ways. And it's funny to think about the kind of control that we've attempted to have post its resurrection. You know, like once you do a performance, because a performance is ephemeral, you know, like it's hard to contain.
Or also I just really enjoyed the personal stories.
Right, because that's the thing. It's like they take on these third worlds with everybody, you know, like, and that's maybe the magic of performance, you know, it's like the third world that's created is like the one that is the experience that you have of what's happening.
Yeah, because performance is so dynamic, it almost becomes like a breathing and living entity, the way an alien might be or an angel might be, you know? And there's some theories that what we might experience as an alien or as an angel or even as a demon is something, there's one school that thinks that it's a pure projection of the internal, which I don't agree with. But then there's another more animist perspective that thinks that the external is actually commingling and interacting with the trigger that is internal. So what are your guys' ideas on what an alien or an angel might sort of be, and how a being like that might be structured, and how it even might take form or might take control in an event such as an artistic performance?
Now I'm literally just trying to be open completely, because I feel like I've been exposed to so much. And there's this really simple thing that is maybe basic, but you know, sometimes something happens, you hear something and you're like, it just works so well for you. And because I feel so analytical and I find holes in things, and it's like, I think I'm trying to prove something even though I know that's not possible. So we know a lot about the brain. Well, we don't know a lot about the brain. We don't really know a lot of what's going out there. Anyway, so this lady was talking, and she was talking about, oh, you see like a bird or a caterpillar in the middle of the street and they're struggling, and you see cars coming. So you're like, okay. And you like pick it up and you put it on the side of the road and you go about your day. Unless you're a bird freak, and then you take it home, and that's cool, but I don't have to do that. I would leave it there. So for us, it was nothing, but like, and we saw it struggling. So like, that's nothing, go on the day. What makes us think that that wouldn't happen to us? Like that some higher being or alien or angel might hear a prayer or a request or see a struggle and just be like, oh, pop it on you. You good. You know, and for them, it may also be something so in passing that it's nothing. Anyways, when I heard that, I was like, oh, bitch, we're gonna live. This is during a quarantine.
Gives you hope.
A quarantine collapse, yeah. Like I'm gonna drop the analytical part of me, not question, and just try to be open. Because as you can tell, sometimes it's not easy for me. Surrendering, in a sense.
I'm just gonna say I've been obsessed with surrender. Oftentimes the results of surrender are much grander and much more sacred than they ever would be if we had imposed our will upon it. And what's interesting about astrological magic and astrology is that we're able to detect, like, or at least describe certain characteristics and certain arrangements within the planets of when they will be responsive to such a call, or when they will be responsive to such a request. Be like, okay, is Venus in a place, right, where it's able to bestow a certain kind of energy towards me, or is Saturn in a place where he's going to negate that, etc. So it's interesting, you know, equating a celestial being to the way that something like a caterpillar might see a human being, something like that. Well, when is it available, right? When is it available for an appeal of some kind? And when must we just surrender and know that some kind of current of what we might call salvation will kind of take over and become part of the narrative?
And she knows what I'm about to say was that I love the etymology. I hated the word surrender, and I know. She does too. But the etymology of like rendre, the second part, means like to give back. And I think we had talked about it before, and it feels really nice, because surrender, sometimes you think it's like giving up or something, when it's really, it's like an opportunity to give back, like maybe to yourself in, you know, the surrender.
Yeah, I love this interpretation of it, because for years we've had this sort of dialogue around the word, because the interpretation, the connotation that I hold in my young mind is the relationship surrender has to like the patriarchy, because it's like this, like surrendering to man or something.
And like war.
In war, or like to me the connotation is around like giving up or giving in. But when Sigrid revealed this etymology to me, I was like, I've come around to it, you know, and now in my own life, surrender has like, the meaning, it takes place, there are so many places it shows up in my life, and especially recently because I've been grieving. There's been a lot of death in my life, and so like surrendering in relationship to grief has been the place in which I've been able to communicate with those who are no longer with me. I don't know, I've been doing a painting series actually about the black hole, which I could actually talk about for a long time, but like the black hole is significant because it used to be a dark place. I'll just quickly say the narrative that like my father was interested in drugs all of his life. He was, you know, and he had struggled with addiction most of his life. And I had come to realize that addiction was coming from a place of like, you know, we could say like depression or anxiety that potentially comes from trauma in his life. And the black hole was that depression or anxiety, and it was also his leaving by way of taking drugs. So I realized that I adopted this feeling of like falling into the black hole. Like, and I would say like I'm always traipsing around it, or I am hanging by a thread above it, and the thread is always about to be cut, and I'm going to fall in this black hole. And often I did, and I still continue to. And but the black hole, the connotation of it was a negative one. It was like, this is a dark place. But then when my father died, and I was surrendering to the understanding of who he was in this lifetime and who he was now, that black hole became a space of communication. And I realized that his addictions, his drug use, was a way for him to go into that spiritual realm and communicate with things that you can't comprehend in this other realm, the incarnate realm. And now I do that. The black hole is a space in which I communicate with my father. And so it's this positive space now. And it's not only just my father in which I'm communicating in that space, it's also the unknown. It's a space of discovery. It's where I go because I'm curious, you know, and I don't have the answers because I think the answers are dangerous, you know, and I'm like, that's where you know, so there's this, that's the surrender.
And because
know?
you have the moon on Neptune in your chart. Literally,
right, yeah.
Literally. I mean, it's seeking sustenance and nourishment and giving form to the formless and the unknown, right? And embracing or nurturing the void, or the dissipation of reality, and the breaking the barriers of what lies beyond the physical and the real. And this is something that is in Monica's natal chart, and that she'll be experiencing again on her solar return. But this brings up so much. I mean, in terms, especially if you're linking it to how mysticism and art are really related. You know what I mean? How if one gets to the point, and the skill level too, where they're able to surrender and be like, all right, something else is going to take over now. Something else, and I just have to trust it. I have to trust that my speech or my movement or my instinct will mirror what this greater presence needs to express through me, right? I kind of really feel like almost all meaningful art has that degree of surrender, right? Like that degree of like, it isn't about me. Something else is moving through me.
Yeah, the vehicle. I mean, that's the other thing that had happened from this experience is like going back to like aliens or angels also, I think that maybe Sigrid and I both agree in this because we're both somatic practitioners, but I'll speak for myself and you can say if you agree, but I truly believe that we're vehicles, like in lack of better words, like we're souls in a body, you know, and like the body is the vehicle and there's a relationship that you have to this, but I guess that meaning to say, like, I think that this isn't everything. Like, we don't die and the lights turn out, you know? And so I think about that, the relationship to transformation in this realm is that's what the FLUCT experience is. Like when we are going on stage to perform, something happens in which I don't feel like I'm the one driving the car anymore. There's this transformation in which it's almost like I'm being moved. And I don't know if I can exactly articulate it, but we both have experienced the same thing.
And I think that the repetition is like a big part of that. Tapping back into what we talked about before, the different iterations, besides there being like different choreography too, the bulk of it is the same piece, and doing it repetitious, this is a ritual, this is like a prayer. We're doing the same thing over and over, and there is like synchronized choreography, right, at certain moments, but a bulk of it is narrative choreography where we're embodying emotions, ideas, and stories. And so when that happens, like, I don't want to cry thinking about it, but it's like we always cry. Like, I don't even know why I'm crying now. Like that's what happens is every time it's like, but it also is funny because she'll be like, oh, she's like, I just started crying at this part. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, but I was crying at this part. Okay. Now we have to go say hi to people. What's happened? It's like, but I think, yeah, the repetition becomes, it is a ritual, and there's a lot that happens for ourselves in there.
The embodiment of I don't know what's coming into us, and I have some theories, about like how my body is responding that I've learned from like the stem of your brain is the oldest part of your body, the oldest part of the body, and when you're experiencing trauma, you release these chemicals that are basically causing you to experience fight or flight, and so your body like literally, I start to gag before every performance, and I think it's because my body is releasing no, what's the thing? Adrenaline. It's releasing adrenaline because it knows that I'm about to go through this thing, and so it's like the gift. It's a little angelic, and some people could argue that it's not, but I think it is. Like, I'm like, those angels are in me. Like, it's like a part of me in some ways. And there's that, but there's other thing I want to mention, which is this Mayan cultural ritual that I always think about in reference to what happens, this thing that happens that I can't explain, which is the transformation in performance. And it's called Ishipla. And it's when the chiefs or the priests, I don't know the exact words, would engage in this ritual. And what they would do is they would dance for very long hours they are becoming the god. They're not just performing the god, they're becoming the god. And usually this god is in relationship to fertility. I've read one story where it's like they wear prisoner of war skin, and then in the skin, they dance until the skin comes off, and it's supposed to represent the maize. And like the corn, the husk coming off of the corn, and representing fertility and agriculture and like food. And anyway, I feel like in some ways that is a part of what we're doing. We're like embracing the ritual of becoming something, and that's why we cry at certain points that we can't really articulate or comprehend. It's like there is this taking on of like a very emotional state, in which we're talking about familial trauma or
also other people's
whatever
stories and experiences as well as our own.
Yeah.
For sure. It's a process of invocation, and I've watched you guys work for so many years and watched you do this for so long that it's unmistakable when you're doing it that something else is taking over, and something else is, as you say, driving or at the wheel. So I love how it goes back to this idea of control. Mm-hmm. And authority figure. I love that name of that piece you guys did, authority figure. Mm-hmm. And this question of control that you're always facing, and how it circles back into like, all right, our own agency and how we work, and what really is at work, and who is at work. Mm-hmm. And are these beings celestial, or are these beings cellular, and what are we meant to unleash, really? It's almost like an invocation is a voluntary unleashing of a kind of energy, or a voluntary surrender to a kind of energy. And an astrological chart is almost like a map of what energies we're meant to unleash, and in what areas, and to what ends, and with what capacity. So it's fascinating how art and dance and ritual and astrology really do fold together in these ways, and how surrender kind of seems to be like the keynote. That chaos is absorbed, and that, I think it's Nietzsche, it is only through chaos that one can give birth to a dancing star. It's through the marriage of effort and grace, and skill and surrender, And it really goes to that. And you two, I mean, my gosh, and everybody you work with, I mean, some of the most inspiring people I know, and how you really, your dedication to your craft, your physical dedication to your craft and its skill, and also your philosophical and intellectual theory that you bring into everything that you do, coupled with the aesthetic and the musical and the physical, right? And the somatic and the audible, and how everything really converges in your guys' work. It's such an inspiring thing, and it's undeniably magical. So if anybody has the opportunity to look further into FLUCT, that's real magic, really. And you guys are so great. And thank you so much for being here. It's been a real privilege. So this interview with FLUCT concludes part 1 of this edition of Time Lord TV. Stay tuned for part 2, featuring our interview with Christina Engelhardt.
Welcome to the program.
Whosoever therefore shall be ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him also shall the Son of Man be ashamed.
What you did was wrong on so many levels. People are going to react.
So this is the seduction of normalcy, I thought, as I smiled back, compromised and radiant. Radiant.
So we're here with Christina Engelhardt, author of this incredible book, Towards the Moon with Fellini. I love this book. I read it cover to cover. I could not stop. Detailing all about your adventures with Federico Fellini and your contact with transdimensional beings.
Yes.
So primarily these beings communicated with the both of you over the telephone, correct?
Yes, and I also believe they actually appeared in different formations. For example, when I would be sleeping, I could feel them in their presence in the room, and I could not move. I was like almost catatonic, and I could feel them touching me, but I couldn't open my eyes. It was like they rendered me. And a few times I felt, I don't want to say the word possessed, but they had some kind of control over me, because that evening I had a friend staying, and they said, I was walking around the house and I was talking on the phone, and I had not one bit of memory. And I almost doubted this person. He said, no, you talked about, and he said things that there was no other way unless I had done that. So there was a lot of that. They were physical, and then through the telephone, and then there were blobs of colored light. I would see almost like a vision, and then of course they'd get into my mind, and when I'd be in some kind of a sleep state, I would see them, and they were very, you know, to me they were scary looking because it was like nothing I've ever seen before.
Yeah, and can you describe their appearance?
So imagine if you look at oil spilt on the pavement on a black street, and you know, you see pinks and silvers. It's kind of like mercury, how it melts together. It's a shape-shifting sound. So when there were several of them looking down at me, and big eyes, and their faces were shape-shifting. Long faces towering over me, and they had no mouths, or I don't even think much of a nose, the eyes, but I could hear their thoughts. They communicated me with their thoughts, which was what I pretty much thought. Later on I found out about the gray beings, that they also had that. But I don't call these the gray beings, from what I've read up on that.
Yeah, I mean, they seem, the reports that you describe in this sense sound a lot like the conventional reports of people who have been contacted and abducted by aliens before. Even this feeling of being loomed over, or the sensation of being loomed over. But what strikes me as fascinating about your story, and completely unique from anything else that I've heard, is that there was direct telephone contact really, really often, and it began with Federico Fellini first was receiving these messages from these voices, right?
Yes.
And then later on they became to dominate yours. So can you explain to us a little bit about how these beings started interacting and communicating first with Fellini, how the two of you came together, and then how the voices became just as big of a part in your life as well?
Thank you. Well, first of all, we are talking about the early 80s, 82, 83, 84, in that time frame. So Federico's in Italy. He is having a moment in his theatrical directing, doing either commercials or just trying to find what is his next project going to be, because he had walked away from several and he thought, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. So he was in a lost stage creatively. And he remembered that he liked the books of Carlos Castaneda. And he was just talking to his writer, Tullio Pinelli. He says, I think I want to reach out to Carlos Castaneda, because in the past, Carlos had written to Federico. So he says, no, I think this is the time. I think that would make my next project. And that's, excuse me, that's when the voices started calling him. So he thought it was Don Juan. It was from that kind of, either it was with Carlos doing some kind of, trickster on him, or, he didn't know quite what it was. He for sure thought this was Carlos Castaneda. Of course, later on, we go on to find that the voices say, no, we're nothing to do with Carlos. We are a completely different entity. But most people in our little entourage, the only thing they could hold on was Carlos, because, wow, look, we want to do a film on Carlos, and all of a sudden these voices start calling. So it just was almost like a perfect synchronicity.
When I was reading the book, I had the same idea. I was like, this has to be Castaneda and his people. It simply has to be, because the stories are just so remarkable and so bizarre. So Federico Fellini, he's making this film. He has this idea to make a film with Carlos Castaneda.
Yes.
These voices start calling him on the phone.
Correct.
And giving him directions of things to do.
Correct.
And one of the directions that these beings sort of lead him toward is his first encounter with you and meeting you, correct? And how did that come to pass?
So while all of this is going on with Federico in Italy, I'm still living in New York City, and I had a psychic, I call her my psychic mama. She would teach me astrology, and I taught her tarot. So, and I've known her since I was a teenager, and so she was reading for me for years, and this one day, she said, that's it, get out of New York, leave, I don't want to see you. And it was basically, she kicked me out of her home, and I couldn't believe it. And she goes, you have to go to LA, you have to be there on October 20th. You're going to hear from a famous Italian director, you're going to hear voices from outer space, and you're going to go live in Italy. And since this woman had never been wrong, Okay, I gave up everything, loaded a car, and drove. And on October 20th, I sat by the phone. I didn't know what else to do. And this strange woman, who we were not friends, called me up and said, "You don't like me and I don't like you, but I have to go to a dinner with an Italian director." And then normally I would have said, "Oh, forget about it," because I didn't trust her. But when she said Italian director, I said, "Oh my, this is too perfect. Yes, I'll be there."
Oh my God.
And then then the car came later on the evening, and I get into a limousine, and there was Fellini's entourage, her, and myself sitting next to, "Hello, I'm Federico Fellini." And so we go have dinner. So the dinner's finishing. You know, I didn't really know. I mean, I had my own interpretations of what this meeting would be. But as the dinner finishes and Federico says, "Okay, we're going to drop you off." And then I think, "Oh, can I invite everyone to my apartment? I do a slideshow." So I project against the wall all these pictures of travels that I've done. And he thought, "Okay, let's do it." And lo and behold, I have pictures of Tulum, Chichen Itza, Uxmal. I don't know that he's going the following day. So when he sees this, he goes, you know, the voices. And I'm like, well, I got my own voices. I didn't know. And then what he was referring to, and then "Thank you very much, beautiful slideshow." And they leave, and I thought, wait a minute. I left New York. I gave up everything for a dinner and a slideshow. I'm like, no, this can't be. I stayed up all night using all my metaphysical occult arts, from ruins, I Ching, tarot, astrology, created a package of just information I had to give to him. So I thought, well, I'm just going to have to call every hotel until I find him, if even he used his real name, because a lot of celebrities don't. And lo and behold, the first hotel, there he was. So I just rushed over. It was 7 o'clock in the morning, because I stayed up all night doing that, my little, esoteric works. And I'm standing at the front desk, and there's a couple of people in front of me, and I'm just minding my own business, holding the package. And the person in front turns around, grabs me by the shoulders, and shakes me. And I look up, and it's Federico. And he said, "You," meaning me from last night, he goes, "You, the voices," remember he was mentioning it during the slideshow, "the voices told me to be here exactly at this time, and the chosen one would be there." So he goes, "Come, we have to go upstairs." And then we go up to his suite, and there's the entourage, and he said, she's the one that the voice spoke about. And then while I'm hearing him now tell me that he's been getting these calls, he thinks it's Castaneda. When he gets the call, he's drained. Nothing makes sense to him. He doesn't know if he's being tricked. He wants to believe that it's something magical, but he's very confused. And while I'm there, the phone rings, and the voices speak to him and saying, "Yes, she's coming with you." And that day, my life changed completely. So I started understanding the telephone was a tool for them, was a very interesting tool. And the craziest thing, because at one point it was once they started calling, they were calling 3-4 times a day, telling me what to do. They would read my thoughts, because I would be thinking something, they'd call, and they would answer what I was thinking. So I'm like, whoa. That's why I don't think it was Castaneda. They were way too powerful.
Events like this would occur, and they would know that you'd all be together, and the phone would ring, and it would be these voices confirming an event like this.
Yes.
And at that point, I'm thinking, okay, well, Andrea or what was it, Francesco, the other?
Maurizio.
Oh, Maurizio, yeah, are obviously in league with Castaneda, and like letting them know that this is going on, because how could this be so accurate all the time? And as the events unfold further and further, it just seems that no human agency could possibly be as aware as these beings seems to be, where they knew your emotional state, they knew where you were, even when you would deliberately select a hotel and a hotel room that did not have, one of them had an old switchboard and whatnot, so everything could be traced. Correct. You went out of your way at times to avoid contact with these beings and remain remote from them, and somehow they were always able to get in touch with you. And so it gets to the point where it's like, this is so uncanny. It simply could not be any human agency. And one of the most striking stories, I thought, was the story of Federico Fellini at the airport, where that gentleman shows up out of the blue.
Yes.
And stop me if I'm telling it incorrectly, but basically he's at LAX, right?
Correct.
And all of a sudden this gentleman walks up to him and hands him an envelope. And Fellini opens up the envelope, and it's a fragment of fabric that exactly matches the band on his fedora.
Well, not only that, he took his hat off and the piece was cut out that fit in. And he says, I never let my hat out of my sight. And this hat came with me from Rome. So he was like, what's going on? How is this possible?
How could someone have made the incision? And then when they go to question the man all of a sudden seems to snap out of a trance and say, well, where am I?
Yeah.
And they said LAX. He's like, but wait, I was at the San Francisco airport last thing I knew.
That's right.
So it's almost like involuntarily, like a sleepwalker almost, this man shows up.
And that's what I mentioned just a moment ago, is that apart from their calling, apart from me seeing like almost like a fog of some colored fog, because they liked colors, apart from them getting into my mind like in a dream state where I would know I was awake but I couldn't move, it could not be one human being or any human being, because it was too fantastical. He cannot get in my mind. Later on in the book, once Colta Maltese comes out, which is the graphic novel with all Fellini, after Yucatan comes out, Andrea De Carlo's book, after Corriere della Sera, the main newspaper, talks about this journey, that I'm called into Federico's office, and he goes, come, we have some people that want to meet you. So I come to his office, and there's 6 people, all in suits and ties, very professional looking, and they say, you know, Carlos and his seers are leaving, and we are looking for a new set for the new seers, and we'd like you both to leave right now, leave your lives, leave everything, come with us, and we're going to make you in charge of our cult. And we both said, no way.
Yeah.
No. But then for 1 month, they followed me around. I thought they were going to kidnap me.
Yeah, they stalked you.
They stalked me. But
Yeah.
you see how they were using human things, hiding behind grocery counters.
Right.
There was nothing.
Okay,
There is no.
so you saw their mortal limitations when they
Yes.
actually were coming for you.
Yes.
You saw how almost like silly their attempts were,
Yeah.
as opposed to these that were, you know, ridiculously high tech, or I mean, well, interestingly low tech, because they seem to prefer analog material,
Yes,
right? And
yes.
they don't like to communicate through digital means of any way.
Right.
So for those who haven't read the book, can you explain a little bit about what the voices sounded like and what kind of messages they conveyed to you and Federico and the other members of your entourage who were
Yes.
all receiving calls?
Yes, I would say predominantly Federico, myself, Tullio Pinelli. I don't think Maurizio got a call, and that made him more suspicious. Andrea might have gotten one. Brink Stevens, the Violet, got one, but I was getting up to 3 to 5 calls a day. For some reason, they were really adamant because they knew I was a good influence on Federico. And also, the other colors, other persons, they thought I was behind it. They thought I was working with Castaneda. I thought it was them, they thought it was me, so it was entangled. But when I first heard the call, as I mentioned, I picked up the phone rings, I pick it up. It sounds like a walkie-talkie, that shh, not like a quiet that you normally. So I thought, this sounds like a walkie-talkie. And a metallic voice, neither male nor female. Now we can create that, but back in the early 80s, I had never heard that. We are talking, and it was in sync to the projection of this walkie-talkie sound. So they said we, so that's why there was not one, it was this conglomerate energy that was making the call. When Tullio said, what do we call you? They said you. So metallic sounding, and for everyone who heard it was the same thing. The vibration, drain, energetically, this metallic sounding like if it was done by a synthesizer, and using this, somehow going through the phone, but not in your normal telephone sound, sounding like a walkie-talkie. So that's what to me was, and as soon as I would pick up the phone and I'd hear that, I'd start shaking because I didn't know what they were going to ask of me, and they sent me on many wild goose chases. So that was the original sound, and then I said when they appeared to me in some kind of a strange unconscious state. I told you the long faces, their faces shape-shifted with colors. So then I thought, oh, that's why they picked colors, but they had no mouths. They were the big head, and that's where they could, and through their eyes, I was terrified because I felt they could look inside me. And so that was another thing. That was probably the scariest. It was draining from the calls, but the scariest is when they came to me and they looked me in the eye. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I'm terrified.
In some ways, it really is kind of a horror story, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's there were times when I've listened to your accounts and I've read in the books, and I'm like, how did you not feel terror? These voices, they seem to know what you were feeling. They knew who you were sleeping with. They would sometimes call you right before having sex with somebody, right? And saying, don't do this. Right? And so it must have felt very invasive. Did you ever get scared? Did your mental health ever suffer? Did you ever get paranoid?
Well, I think that what kept me sane was already having a strong background in the metaphysical arts. And that I knew so much about astrology, and I knew that my strong 5th house and the 6th house and the 8th house, that I knew that I could be a creative psychic healer. I said, okay, this is what I'm here on this earth for. I realized in that moment it wasn't about being an actress or a model or having these crazy, lifestyle affairs. It was about really tapping into this phenomena, and that I would learn about it and maybe be able to present it understandably, as we're trying to do right now, make sense to our audience that we can be so lucky and be chosen for something like this. And I don't mean chosen biblically. I mean that we're still enough to have these feelings, because it does take a certain amount of your own individual being aware and open, and at the same token, your own curiosity to not lose your mind. But I have to say there were times that I made a mistake. I've been told a few people, oh, I'm receiving calls. They right away said, you're not welcome here anymore.
Right. So when they spoke to you, they spoke in English. But when they spoke to Federico, they spoke in Italian.
And Eugenio, when they finally spoke to him, because he wanted so badly, it was Italian. And it was funny because when they spoke to Eugenio, it was our wedding day, and it was that morning we were getting ready, and he finally picks up the phone, and he hears that. He says, oh yes, it was exactly that. So he finally believed me. All those years he didn't believe me. That was torturous. But when he gets the call, he hears that they speak Italian, and they say, Eugenio, they say his name. Eugenio, we're very happy that you're getting married. We wish we could be there with you, but we are, in Italian, they don't say aliens, they say I marziani, Martians. Yeah, we are Martians, we cannot be there, but look up at the sky. So that, and at 2222. So he thought, wow.
The phone really was the thing that made me the most confused. I'm like, okay, you obviously are, have psychic abilities, right? You have all these gifts, you're a medium. Why not simply channel, right? Why use the phone? And I was really curious as to why they would decide to use the telephone as their primary means of communication.
Yes.
Now, granted, they were able to communicate with a broader spectrum of your entourage, and I use the word spectrum almost in a pun sense because the voices gave you all colors, right?
Yes.
And they only referred to you by your colors, never by your names.
No, never by names. In the beginning, I was called first I was called the physical one for a day, and then I became the spiritual one for the next moment, and then Federico called me up and he said, the voices told me that you were the pink one. So in Italian, rosa is pink. So that was my color, and I was like, And then I thought, well, he's the green one and the pink, which are complementary. So yeah, that's true. And because there was also an event where they wanted us to make music and sounds, and I kept thinking, they're trying to communicate with us. So I have a feeling that they are so far advanced in how they, exist. And for us, in a very physical material where we needed the phone to almost have a differentiation, because if they got into our heads and then we probably heard an inner voice, we wouldn't know how to say, oh, this is just me losing my mind, or I'm getting communicated. I think that's why it was a physical phone. And there is a chapter in the book where Tullio Pinelli, he was also getting calls. And I was so awestruck, I just listened to commands, but he said, how are you making these calls? Where are you calling from? And they said, we were never born. We're not dead, and we were never born. We're from an energy source, and to make this call, it takes enormous amount of energy from wherever they are, dimensional, to make the phone ring. So it's not a random thing. It's like exhausting for them. Just as me talking and listening, I felt shaking and as if I was breaking out in a hot sweat in that moment. You definitely felt the phone call.
Yeah, and
it was very strange.
Fellini and other members of the entourage explained that too, that they'd pick up the phone and unmistakably something supernatural, or at least highly emotional, was happening, where the nervous system seemed to respond and get very tense and sweaty and almost like nervous while it was happening, as though it was almost too much for the nervous system to sustain. And then what also fascinated me is that you were all given numbers. Federico was the green one, and you were the pink one, and then the other two gentlemen were the blue and the orange one. And I thought, naturally, as an astrologer and as somebody who studies Kabbalah, I start using, my classical associations with colors and planets and things like that. And I think to myself, like, oh, sort of green and pink are both sort of associated with Venus in a way, according to certain vocabularies, mystical vocabularies. There's obviously corollary and different corollaries.
Also heart chakra.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And then, blue is, say, Jupiter, right? And orange is Mercury. And these people played these different roles because I believe the Jupiter role was sort of played by the benefactor, and the Mercury role was played more by the scribe, right?
That's right.
So everybody's kind of archetype was almost mirrored in the colors that they're given. However, the beings never used the colors either red or black for any of you.
Correct.
And this struck me as very interesting because in traditional Kabbalistic and Hermetic schemes, black is the color of Saturn and red is the color of Mars.
That's
and these are the malefic planets.
That's right. This is true.
So it's interesting to me, why do you think it was that they chose the rest of the color spectrum but eliminated both black and red from the scheme?
All right. Now, this is actually very interesting that you pinpoint it, because if you said to me, Christina, what was their goal? What were they trying to accomplish? They wanted Federico to direct a movie, cinema, film. That's all the artistic worlds. They wanted music, they wanted lights, they wanted colors, which is all very creative. Whereas versus Saturn and Mars are very much responsibility, doing action. But I think from where their dimension is, physical contact, touch, romance, sexuality, art, all the things that we put romance into is probably for them the strangest thing. Probably Mars and Saturn is very, very practical. And so the unpractical, the artistic realm is probably why they went to someone like me who was artistic, or Federico, or the scribe, the writer that Andrea was. And the reason they picked the benefic planets versus malefic is because they themselves wanted to live vicariously through the art and the romance through us, which you've read. What did they call themselves? You. And I thought, how interesting. We say thank you, how are you? So the word you means other. And maybe that's how they interpreted you, as other. They're something other.
I just got goosebumps actually because I read this book about Tiepolo, the Italian painter Tiepolo, and it was a very esoteric book and about all these esoteric things that are found in his paintings and stuff. And the author at one point refers to Moses and a scene from the Old Testament and when God spoke to Moses in the Old Testament. And Moses says, he says, "Who are you?" And God responds with the word that's used often in Kabbalah, Eheye. He responds with the word, "I am that I am." And then Moses is like, "Well, why have you chosen me?" And the voice says, "I am that I am," almost as though it's angry, like, don't you understand that I am and you are, there is no distinction, and that there is almost this like, in these dimensional spaces where we are dealing with deities or we are dealing with angels or aliens, and what is the crossover between what we call angels and what we call aliens, and are they even one and the same? And they have this strange manner of non-differentiating pronouns between I and thou, and even in Sanskrit, in Vedic text, tatvam asi, like I am that and thou art that, are interchangeable words. So it's almost this spiritual idea of I am speaking to you, but you are also me.
It's very interesting. It's very, very interesting. So here we are in the 80s, Federico, myself, having this encounter. And obviously, I don't think they just randomly appeared. I think they were on this earth plane having, as you're saying, who knows? If they were never born and they never died, then they're timeless on some level. And therefore, that could put them back in Moses' times or throughout the history of humanity, and probably watching over us, and probably thinking, you know, maybe on their realm, something creative, an art piece, would suffice the human consciousness to understand there is something otherly. And I'll bring this up. Out of the many calls, finally they said, "Do you have any questions?" And I thought, is there Jesus? Is there, you know, and I said, is there reincarnation? And they said, yes, absolutely. We reincarnate many times. In fact, I have reincarnated from them. I'm one of them. So on some level of energy, when I was pure energy, before I was born, or there was that time before we're in our physical bodies, we are a spirit, I was apart from them, which now that makes me think, is this, you know, again, is this angels? Where is this coming from? But that phone call that they said I was one of them, that made me take my life very, very interesting. I knew that, okay, this is not a random life. I have to be here to serve, to do something great, to do something artistic, to tell this story. I could not leave this planet without telling the story. That's why it took so long to write it, not because I didn't want to. I just thought, people think I'm crazy, you know. So, but only when the consciousness of other people were starting to have their own spiritual revelations, I said, nope, it's time for mine. And but it was awe-shocking to think that before I incarnated, when I was spirit, I was connected to them. What if they reach out and saying, okay, now come with us. Okay, you're not done. We have another project. So that has been a fear of mine, that they come up. That's why I thought I do the book. It actually brings all the colors back together, because one person's here, we're all spread out throughout the globe. But this book is actually, by mentioning their names, it's our way of bringing us back together. So I don't know if it'll stimulate something.
Yeah.
You know, we are in a very magical house. I'm here with, you're a magical person. So we are stirring up the energy. So I have to agree to that. You know, that's what metaphysical energies do.
Definitely. I mean, when I read this book, I completely was just like, this has to be a film. This has to be a something. And it's interesting how it did have a pedigree. I know that Andrea wrote kind of a novel about it, right? And Fellini did sort of put out a
graphic novel,
right? Like a graphic novel thing. But it was, you know, it was very fantastical and sort of sci-fi seeming, whereas your account of it is very just normal. Like, we were on our way to dinner, we were doing this, and all of a sudden this voice would come in, and that's what makes it feel so real, and that's what makes it feel so terrifying.
And if you said, well, where did they go? Federico said, I'm not interested in the film. I did the book. I did towards his last film, The Voice of the Moon. You know, he did these random attempts. Andrea wrote a book, but he kind of went, I don't know where he went with it. That was sort of like cherry-picked. He cherry-picked, but there was, like, he didn't want to use any real reality to it. And then I thought, no, I'm going to say a book from the day this happened, that happened, almost like a memoir.
Yes.
Versus a story.
Yes, and it's so well chronicled. It's just really, it sounds like I'm sitting here talking to you when I read the book. You know, you have a very fluid style, and it just really goes, so every event is so remarkable. And of course, you've lived such a colorful life, and you know, society parties and celebrity
And I'm all over HBO right now. Don't Google me.
Yeah, no, I saw you actually on that. Yeah.
Don't go there.
Yeah, I saw you on that. But yeah, you've lived this colorful and amazing life. And yet, you know, you're able to write this book, and it's so well written and beautifully done. And, you know, I really applaud not only your skill in conveying the information, but also just your openness and courage to talk about stuff that is really scary. I mean, I would be scared. I really think I would.
Yeah.
If I was
Because it wasn't once or twice. It went on for years.
For years. Yeah, I mean, years of people knowing, or not people, I mean, you know, but entities knowing, like, who you're sleeping with, what you're thinking, every little thing. I'd be like, well, whoa, I'm going to start to go crazy. I'm going to start to feel like, you know, I've got this constant surveillance. So your courage in conveying this, and you know how there's never any change in the way you describe it either, and it's so consistent, and you make the unbelievable believable with this book.
Oh, well, like I said, even today I'm thinking that it's people like yourselves who have not just a curiosity, an education, a worldliness to the metaphysics, to your spirituality, that it's not an impossible idea. There's possibility in that realm. And that's what I would only hope for in an audience, that the audience today looks, you know, into what is the spiritual realm, how it does connect with us. And look, now we turn to CNN and the Pentagon, they're all talking about there is something out there. We are seeing, you know, unidentified flying objects, you know, from UFOs to UPAs, you know. This might become a normal thing to discuss in the future, and the old antiquated things will start falling aside. You know, we'll start realizing the dimensionality of our own existence.
Yeah, and a book like this will be looked back on like, oh, it was all there. I mean, this is the matter from which we, you know, are able to understand these phenomena and understand beings like this. You know, I mean, this has to be made into a film. I know that you're still carrying on the process, right, of trying to get this produced.
Eugenio has gotten very involved. He wants to do it. Then there's another director who sat down with me, interviewed me, and then I found out he took my interview, was trying to make a film. All right, you know, everyone's trying, but you know, it's going to happen in its own right. There'll one day be a very big director who is, you know, a David Lynch or a Tim Burton or someone who's just got that mind to go into it and cherry pick the idea and tell a story. And there's also there's constantly little documentaries coming out where they're trying to talk about Fellini's moment of this, you know, spiritual clarity or esoteric clarity. And we'll see, you know, but everyone's going around this. But if they want the source, the manuscript of the day-to-day, this is the best that I could do. That's why I had to do it.
You did a spectacular job. Towards the Moon with Fellini by Christina Engelhardt. Definitely get yourself a copy. It's not only is it awesome and fascinating, it's super well written and funny and cool. So this is one of my favorite recent reads, and thank you so much for writing such a beautiful book, and thanks so much for being here and sharing with us about it.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And look beyond the stars. We are mysteries among mysteries.
And we will see you next time on Time Lord TV.
Thank you.